Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Greg and welcome to the second part of how I built this absolutely beautiful epoxy table. I am going to leave a link now. If you want to go and check out part 1, you absolutely have to go and check out part 1 to fully understand where we come from and how to build the epoxy table. So I'm just apologizing in advance. We recently invested in a new camera, and between the old camera and the new camera we did unfortunately lose some footage, and the footage we lost was basically from part 1 to part 2, where we took this epoxy table out of the mold and took it to our CNC supplier to flatten the slab. That's the footage we lost, unfortunately. I do apologize for that. But continuing with the video, the specific epoxy I'm using, I can only cast about 10 to 12 mils at a time. So for this specific project, we done a total of 4 pours. That left us to about 50 to 55 mils total on this table. And our client decided to go with a charcoal smoky type of color that absolutely came out beautiful at the end of this project. Now, doing your first pour, you will see that most of your air bubbles will come up, and you can just use your flame gas gun to remove all your air bubbles from your epoxy table. And obviously repeating the same steps with all the other castings you do, unless you do a deep pour. But for this project, we done a layer pouring system for this table. So this is the part where we lost some footage, but having the table back at our shop, we put it on a table with a very soft blanket at the bottom so you don't scratch your table. And we're starting off by sanding our table with our FESTOOL ROTEX machine, obviously in a ROTEX mode. If you don't know, the ROTEX mode on your FESTOOL orbital sander is basically, it's a very aggressive sanding mode, and that's basically removing all the big marks the CNC machine made. And I can promise you now, investing in one of these machines is going to save you a lot of time. And we ultimately used our belt sander before, but we completely moved away from that because the belt sander is a very aggressive sanding method and it's leaving very deep lines and marks inside your epoxy. And as you can see here, the ROTEX machine is obviously moving in orbital motion, and that's removing basically all the marks the CNC machine made on your epoxy table. And one of the questions I receive a lot is, do you repeat the same process at the back of your tables? Yes, obviously. The client is paying a lot of money for this table, so obviously you want to give them the absolute best table you can give them, and that's why we repeat the same process at both sides. Now, this is a very important step in building your epoxy table. We only sanded our table starting off with the 80 grit, then immediately moving to our FESTOOL ETS5 sanding machine. Now this is a finishing sander. Now this is very important. If you're going to continue with any normal orbital sander, you will definitely get swirl marks on your epoxy table. Now this is where we invested in the FESTOOL ETS sanding machine, and this is a finishing sander. Now that basically means that it's built for finishing your product. And as you can see, I am moving in lines to make sure that I sand my complete table. So after sanding my second layer with 100 grit sandpaper, this is in part 1 video where I mentioned always remember to build your mold and your table slightly bigger so you can cut your table to its final size later on. Now, using my FESTOOL track saw, this made the job absolutely easy by cutting my table to its final size. And obviously remember, your track saw will definitely not leave a smooth surface on the side of your table. And after cutting with your track saw, cutting your table to its final size, then we are going to continue sanding our table with our finishing sander to remove all the ugly marks the track saw made on the side of our tables. Now remember, this is still a 100 grit sandpaper, and we're going to continue sanding with a 100 grit sandpaper, then moving to a 120 grit, and then moving to a 180 grit sandpaper, 220 grit sandpaper, and then we're going to go to a 320 grit sandpaper before we continue moving to the next step. So stopping at 320 grit, this is normally where we will start routering our table. Now using my FESTOOL router, this thing is an absolute beast. I'm just giving my table a small chamfer, 45-degree chamfer, right around my table, on top and at the bottom. And I just want to point this out to you. Just check how incredibly good the dust extraction on this FESTOOL machine is. It makes absolutely no dust, and it's sucking out all the epoxy particles that the router is making under the machine. So after we finished routering our table right around, we are going to move to the finishing stages of our epoxy table. Now we're moving on to a 400 grit sandpaper, then we're going to move on to a 600 grit sandpaper. And I just want to point something out. When you start sanding from your 400 grit sandpapers up, you need to make sure you use an airbrush all the time, using your orbital sander for about 20 seconds sanding, removing your sand pad from your table, and making sure you use an airbrush to remove all the small dust particles underneath your sander. Finishing off with 800 grit sandpaper, this is the most critical part of your sanding process, and we like to sand in a circular motion. And you will see I like to sand on the epoxy, but when I finish sanding, I will lift my sander up on the wood part of my table, and when I start sanding, I will start sanding on the wood section of my table, repeating the same process, sanding for about 20 to 25 seconds, and making sure the underside of your pad are always clean. And always remember, don't apply pressure on this step of your sanding process. I'm applying absolutely no pressure on my sander, and this will help you to remove most of your swirl marks on your table. The other question we also receive a lot is, how do we fasten our steel bases to the underside of our table? Well, we normally use threaded inserts on all our tables, and I know you're judging me now because I haven't got a wood bit here. I use the steel bit, and I know the next step you're also going to judge me and must probably leave me a bad comment. Please don't do that. My countersink bit is lost, and I had this weird little file thing in my drawer I used to make a small countersink bit for the threaded insert, and you know what, this actually worked perfectly. After cutting your threaded insert hole, I'm just using my sander, using an airbrush to remove all the dust, and then applying my threaded insert into my hole. And you will see now this is absolutely sitting like a glove. So oiling our table, we are going to use Odis Oil Super Duper, and you need to make sure you shake it well before you use it. So we will start off with Super Duper. It's an oil that penetrates into the wood more than your normal original Odis oil. And I'm using a new brush pad, the white pad you see there. And starting off with a new pad, you will see that you will not get that far when you start using Odis oil until the pad soaks up most of the oil. Then you will see you will get much more spreading ratio on your surface where you're going to oil your epoxy table. And remember guys, it's now September 2021. In October our website will be live. And that basically means that I am currently busy with a document going into full detail on how to build epoxy tables from start to finish, every single thing you need to know on building these tables. I will obviously announce this on our social media platforms. I will leave a link down in the description where you can find us and where you will be able to download this document. And remember, before you go, I will leave a link down in the description of all the tools I use if you are interested. And remember guys, if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to our channel, like this video, it's honestly going to help us. Enjoy the video guys, I'll see you next week. Cheers.